Welcome to The Flux, where we hear stories from people who've asked what-if questions to better understand the world and talk about how data can help tell stories that impact decisions and create an intentional impact on the future. This is your host, John Cordier, CEO at Epistemix. In a world where the flux capacitor from Back to the Future does not yet exist, people have to make difficult decisions without always knowing how the future will play out. Our guests are people who've taken risks, made decisions when uncertainty was high, and who have assisted decision makers by using data and models. We hope you can turn lessons from our podcast into foresight so you or your organization can make better decisions and create an intentional impact for others. Hey there, welcome to the next episode of The Flux. Today, we're on with Don Burke, co-founder of Epistemix. So Don, why don't you give us a little bit of the story of what got you into modeling in complex systems, computational social science in the first place?
Yeah, thanks, John. I'm an infectious disease physician by training, and early in my career went into the Army and did infectious disease vaccine research. To do that, we did a lot of epidemiology about disease transmission. I moved to Bangkok and worked on tropical diseases in Thailand, Japanese encephalitis and dengue and hepatitis, and really exciting stuff for a young guy. But we worked on vaccines. We co-developed a vaccine against Japanese encephalitis that worked and saved probably 30 or 40,000 kids from getting paralysis. Worked on dengue vaccines, didn't really get a successful vaccine during the time I worked on it. Worked on hepatitis A, and handed that off to SmithKline. And I was the sixth person in the world to get the hepatitis A vaccine because we developed it when I was at Walter Reed. So my point being is that I was a pretty applied researcher in infectious diseases, and I really wasn't using modeling and simulation at all. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I did.
You guys were just giving each other vaccines as you were developing them.
That was the way you did it in the old days. If you believed in your vaccine, you were the first person to sign up for it.
Mm-hmm.
They said today the ethics are that you're not supposed to do that, but to me that seems like a pretty clear ethical standard. And then when HIV came along, we also did the same thing. Every time there was a new epidemic anywhere in the world, I traveled, collected viruses, brought them back. We did genetic sequencing of the viruses and tried to make sense out of how the virus was evolving and transmitting. We were the first serious global molecular epidemiology of HIV. The reason the military was interested in that is we have troops all around the world, and we were working on vaccines against HIV. And so we wanted to know if there were different types in different parts of the world, whether or not you'd need additional vaccines. So we're doing that and discovered that HIV was recombining. It was swapping genomes as well as mutating. And we could start to make sense out of the molecular evolution. So as I was studying that, I was wondering how the virus used what techniques it used to mutate and evolve, and read about a technique that was being used in the early years of artificial intelligence called genetic programming or evolutionary programming. And one of the major methods for that was a method called genetic algorithms. And genetic algorithms were designed by a person named John Holland, a computer scientist at Michigan, who consciously borrowed from biology to say, how do biological systems solve problems through evolution? And he applied that to computer science, and then that was being used widely to try to solve problems. You would write code, and you would allow it to become modified, and you allow the modifications to recombine with each other. And then you would test which one solves the problem the best. And I came across people at the Navy Center for Applied Research in Artificial Intelligence who were using genetic algorithms. They were former students of John Holland's. And the Navy had invested a significant amount in methods for machine learning and evolutionary. They were teaching torpedoes how to chase other torpedoes, anticipating what the strategies, evasion strategies that a torpedo would use. But the method, because it was originally derived from biology, was actually pretty close to the way HIV was evolving. And I had tons of data on HIV evolution globally, and they had a simulation tool for simulating evolution. And so we started building simulated viral evolution. And I cannot tell you how much fun that was. It was my principal collaborator there was John Greffenstedt, who became a longtime friend and co-founder of Epidemics. And so I was still in the Army at the time, and I would regularly go to the Navy Center for Applied Research, and we would have our sit-down research sessions and ended up writing a couple papers where we simulated HIV evolution. It was really a cute system. We didn't code for amino acids, so tRNAs. We encoded the letters in the Roman alphabet, A, B, C, D, and so the triplet codons that we had coded for letters, and the problem that the viruses had was to solve how to spell words and sentences and get that correctly. And so it was relatively easy for us humans mentally to follow that, and we did. And so the first set of problems we gave them were to solve the problem of how do you spell core protein polymerase in envelope, which is a joke because that's what the biology is. And then we turned them loose, and then we let them have different mutation rates, their different recombination methods, and we essentially had contests between different evolutionary strategies. And it was really cool that we were able to come up with methods that were the most efficient, and at the same time, they turned out to be pretty similar to what HIV was doing in the first place. So that was my epiphany. That was the notion that, oh my God, you can take electrons in code and that can simulate what goes on in biology and end up with a conclusion where you didn't study the biology, you studied the simulation and came up with what was the same sort of read. You had a better understanding of the system. And that was when I became a born-again modeler. That was my life-changing moment. That after a long career, and a successful career in building real-world stuff, that I realized that I could do that better if I used modeling and simulation. So that set me off on my modeling and simulation career.
So from that aha moment, what came next?
Yeah, so then that was just about the same time that I retired from the military and went to Johns Hopkins, took a professorship there and director of the Center for Immunization Research. So I kept doing pretty much what I was already skilled at, but I started to build my own personal capability in modeling and simulation. I don't have any training in that. I don't have a background in that. So I had to do on the fly the training. The way I did that was I got some graduate students who were interested in modeling and real world. I knew dengue and I knew the real world data inside and out. And so I could help the students by getting the right data to feed the models and ask the right questions. And I ended up having a couple of terrific graduate students who taught me how to model. And it was a gradual process. So Justin Lessler and Derek Cummings, they're both professors now. Derek's back at Johns Hopkins as a professor. Justin's at North Carolina as a professor. And they're really bright guys who we had fun too. So that was the next process. After that, once we got started, I was able to get some smaller grants that related to climate and infectious diseases of dengue and others from NOAA and the like. And that worked out okay. And so we started to build a little group around modeling, and 9/11 hit. And that was a major inflection point in modeling in the United States. So people started to take modeling and simulation more seriously. After 9/11, there was the anthrax attacks at the Capitol, and there was serious concern about biodefense and biological warfare. And particularly the concern was about smallpox and whether or not smallpox would be used as a biological weapon or not. And this was a hot topic. Should we immunize everybody in the United States against smallpox? And at the time, in the George Bush and Cheney White House, the predominant opinion was, yes, we should do that because the threat is so great.
Wow.
And there was a good guy at Yale, Ed Kaplan, who was in the School of Management, wrote a paper in PNAS that said that, that of the options, that was the best option. And it was a modeling and simulation paper, not agent-based, but equation-based. And the people who were real-world experienced in smallpox, particularly D.A. Henderson, who had led the global smallpox eradication, were appalled at the notion of immunizing everybody with a vaccine that had a lot of complications. And as it turned out, DA was my suite mate at Hopkins, so we got to know each other quite well. And at that time, I had gone to a meeting and sat next to a person who was an agent-based modeler, Josh Epstein. Mm-hmm. Josh and I hit it off and decided that we could probably do some modeling together. So I was at Hopkins. I would go down to Brookings where he was regularly, and we would meet and work on agent-based modeling. Josh was on the program earlier, but he's been one of the godfathers of agent-based modeling for decision-making in human societies, growing artificial societies, and the like. Mm-hmm. And so we built some smallpox models, and we're interested in the effect of vaccination and what could we do, ring immunization versus immunizing everybody. And just as we were doing that, the DA was at the White House, then became the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, and a major position at the time, worrying about biodefense. And he was adamantly opposed to the idea of vaccinating everybody in the United States. When they eradicated smallpox globally, they didn't do that. They went around and did, every time they found a case, they would do ring immunization. They would vaccinate just the people in the area around a new case. And he thought that if we had a smallpox attack, that's the way we could contain it. But he had this Yale professor's paper. He had Dick Cheney. He had the opposite side of people who were saying that they should go ahead. So he asked if we could do some models as well to compare the different strategies. There were a couple other groups that he invited in as well. One was Steve Eubank at Los Alamos. Another one was Beth Halloran and Ira Longini from Emory. And we met at the Stonehouse at NIH at his DA's invitation. He was able to cut us some fast contracts to do the work under an emergency basis. And we had a work group on smallpox. And this was the proto-MIDAS. This was okay. And so we did our modeling, and you won't be surprised to find out that we all modeled and agreed that you didn't need to vaccinate everybody in the United States. And that now we had dueling models about what the right answer was. And so that's how we got started in the agent-based modeling and the modeling for infectious diseases, but also it was the realization that if you're going to be making important decisions about big strategy, like do you immunize everybody in the United States? I think it was Bernoulli who said that having a little bit of modeling in support of a decision is probably not a bad thing. Mm-hmm. And so that's what got us launched on the, and then the NIH did, based on what was perceived as the value and success of that group, the NIGMS then did institute the MIDAS program, the Models of Infectious Disease Agent Studies. And we successfully, my group at Hopkins, put in for one of those modeling groups and won it. So that was my beginning as being a modeler. I'm the first person to confess that I am not trained as a computationalist. I'm trained as a infectious disease epidemiologist. My main contribution all along has been to understand the problems, pose them well, find smart people who can work on them, and bring resources together to make that happen. And one of my heroes in biology is Barbara McClintock, who won a Nobel Prize for the genetics of corn, of maize, and how there were transposable elements that wasn't strict Mendelian, that there were some genetic elements that could move. And she showed that. But her biography is entitled A Feeling for the Organism. And I always thought that was such an apt way of talking about that kind of expertise with a deep understanding of a particular problem that gives you the sort of the leg up on somebody who doesn't have that. And so I think I'll modestly say that I think I have a feeling for the organism of having a full career of working around the globe on infectious disease epidemiology. I think that's one of the things that lets me see the right problems and pose them well. And so then from then on, the MIDAS program went on at Hopkins. And when I moved to Pitt, I brought that center. We became a center of excellence with the even larger group and had subs in with Josh stayed as a sub and had Roy Anderson and Neil Ferguson as subs to us. And so it was probably one of the most powerful modeling groups in the world.
Okay. So John, from the beginning of MIDAS to where you've seen MIDAS and at least agent-based modeling and simulation in the infectious disease world evolve over the last 15 or so years, where are you excited about new areas for agent-based modeling and infectious disease simulation to go?
I will continue with that MIDAS story a little bit more to fill it out. That when we applied for a center of excellence, I did ask Roy Anderson, who was probably Roy Anderson and Robert May in England were the leading modelers. They wrote the book that everybody used on modeling. Non-US were not allowed to compete for the NIH funding, so they were happy to be a sub to us. So I was quick to corner some of the best talent in the world. And among them was Neil Ferguson, who had been with Roy. I had met him some years earlier when he was a postdoc. And a very smart guy, trained as a statistical physicist, had all the right computational tools and understanding of complex system dynamics. And so we decided at that time avian flu was a threat in Southeast Asia. H5 was raging through all of the poultry in Southeast Asia, and there were a few cases of human cases. And so the concern then was that there would be an outbreak and a major epidemic that would come out. And so we built some large-scale agent-based models of transmission of influenza. And again, because the MIDAS group was doing this, Steve Eubank and Betts and Ira and others started to work together. So it was a collective. And at the time, the White House, now that there was some credibility to the process, Richard Hatchett was at the White House, and they convened the groups to advise them about how to go about what are the best strategies for containing a major new epidemic that led to the targeted layer containment and the like that was subsequently used. So those papers that we wrote, Neil and I and a team, were one for Southeast Asia, one for the United States and the UK, where they were published in Nature in 2005, 2006, were influential in terms of how you approach your influenza epidemic control. I should add, as a interesting parenthesis, is that initial model, that modeling platform that Neil built for these models was what he used when COVID broke out in 2000. So he had a platform that was already ready to do the simulations and simulated COVID for the US and the UK, because that wasn't a whole lot different than what we'd already done for influenza. And correctly said that the epidemic, given the trajectory, could kill 1 million Americans and 500,000 people in the UK. Very influential paper, but it was the son of. But the problem with that model is nobody else could use it other than Neil. It was a research hack, and it was good, but it wasn't final. So there were agent-based models out there that were doing well. But when I went to Pitt, I hired John Greffenstedt. I called him up and said, John was a friend, and asked him if he would be willing to come to Pittsburgh to lead a center for infectious disease modeling, the Public Health Dynamics Laboratory. And I didn't know it at the time, but John was born and brought up in Pittsburgh. His parents were there. I think he has 10 siblings or something like that are scattered across. An amazing family, by the way, every one of them. Judges and musicians and business people, just extraordinarily talented family. And John was happy to come back. And so we worked together. And among the things that we did was to say that we really needed an agent-based modeling platform that was usable by not just the creator, that it needed to be done by industry standards. And so we had a team start to build that under John's direction. Yeah. And that was what the original Fred model was. So there have been a series of, well, first, from this is my vantage, everybody has their own perspective. I first worked with Josh and getting the toy models on smallpox, and then worked with Neil on getting the research software for real world flu problems, and then worked with John to start to build a platform that would be a professional grade software platform that with realistic populations and everything that Fred has. So that was the progression from my point of view. And my job on this site was just to be, I was the program director and helped guide the thinking of the people who were working with me that these were important problems to work on.
Mm-hmm. As the next evolution of Fred comes to be on the more commercial side and working on the getting Fred and agent-based modeling adopted more and more, where do you think the field is ultimately going to end up going? Is it going to be just about disease epidemics, or are there other areas that you think agent-based simulation is going to take off in?
Yeah, for the entire time that we were building the Fred platform, then John and I talked about this, John Greffenstedt and I talked about this many times about that shouldn't be just a platform for infectious diseases. It should be a platform for transmissibility of anything which is transmissible human to human. And for whether that's attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, whether or not it's political persuasion, whether it's anti-vaccine movement sentiments, whether it's religion, political affiliation. So Fred has that capability of representing anything which is transmittable, social contagions as well as its microbial contagions. And the reason for that is that infectious diseases are one very important real-world practical problem, but so much of the social dynamics are currently not modelable, that it's my own perception. I'm not a social scientist, but I do observe that when we try to model infectious disease epidemics, modeling the virus is the easy part, modeling the humans is the hard part. And I think the field will go is that we will get better at representing how decisions are transmitted through people to each other. And that the vehicle for transmission can be in person, can be social networks, and there may be features of transmissibility that favor one route versus another. But I do think that where the field of modeling, and particularly agent-based modeling, will be going is how attitudes and beliefs and behaviors emerge, how they're transmitted. Yeah, and to do that, we're going to have to get better at understanding the mechanisms and the data streams. Those are big lifts because we're actually pretty lousy, we, meaning the entire scientific community, pretty lousy at both of representing mechanistically how people make decisions. And we also don't have data streams that conveniently feed those mechanistic representations that we already do have. In health behavior and other areas, we have a lot of simple theories about how you do that, but there are things like perceptions of risk, perceptions of self-efficacy, trust. Those are factors that go in, but then how do you measure those things?
Mm-hmm.
Data come from if you want a real world. Nice thing about Fred and with the real synthetic populations, one factor, say trust in sources of information, will vary widely depending on who you are and where you are in your own genetics, your own family, your own history of the region. And so even a single factor like that, we know is going to change dependent on the individual agent. And in fact, we can do that. And the assumption will be that for other factors like whether or not you have a belief that what you do can actually change things, that probably changes from person to person and based on their characteristics too. In the long run, I think that's what we're going to do. You know what the fantasy at the end of the day is? Yeah, we're going to.
Let's hear it. Yeah.
We will be doing brain scanning that allows you where the trust area lights up in the brain. And you'll be able to measure that. And instead of just asking people, do you trust this source of information, you can show them a picture of Uncle Sam, and they will either glow red or glow blue. And that will give you information about that particular aspect of what's going on inside their head. You and I have talked about this notion of little minds. As it is, we have little immune systems in our models right now. We do represent immunity instilled in the individual agents and how long it lasts and what are the factors that. And so we not only need that. That's the nice thing about an agent-based model. You can put in a little immune system or a little mind or a little spleen and represent that. Little spleens probably aren't quite as important for direct contagion, but little minds are terrifically important. And so I think that's where it's going to go. I can't chart out a route there, but I would love to get social scientists together to discuss if we want to move the field to understanding the dynamics of behavioral contagion. What do we really need to do? What if we had a moonshot for understanding human behavioral? And by the way, when I say moonshot, this is such an important issue. You ground our epidemic control efforts to a halt in many parts of the country because of this irrational fear of vaccines and the behavioral contagion that was not based on rational decision making. So understanding that if I were king, this would be something I would be investing in. I would be, and there are investments, and the NSF and others do have some efforts in this area, but I think that it's underfunded and it's not well organized. And what I believe is that agent-based platforms like FRAD are going to be instrumental in helping those fields advance.
Absolutely. So even looking at fields of economics and other things where they assume, for the most part, rational decision-making in agents, the COVID pandemic and plenty of other examples illustrate that's not totally how people make decisions. And that's a good virtue of agent-based modeling. One of the things that we've talked about in the past is the idea of the campfire concept, being able to bring different types of people together, the computationalists, the qualitative type researchers. I think that might be another good thing to discuss in the grand vision of being able to communicate across these different fields and different types of people. So I think it'd be good for some of our listeners to hear your grand vision on the campfire concept and how that plays out.
When I started to get into modeling more than 20 years ago now, I had my students read a book called Serious Play, and it was by a person at the MIT Media Lab, Michael Sharaga, I think. The whole idea of his notion was that serious play was that by having a thing in front of you that you manipulate and you noodle around with it jointly, forces you to share explicit representations of what's going on, and whether or not that's an Excel spreadsheet or a clay model of the latest Chevrolet or any kind of model that is built that isn't in words, but is yet another representation of the ideas in a different medium, it allows for communication. And so John Greffinstead and I, when we wrote a little paper on this, we did then a campfire where you sitting around a campfire, and the model itself is the place where you swap your ideas about what's going on. By having the explicit representation in front of you, then that's what you end up sharing with each other. But when you use words, or even when you use equations that lump lots of subvariables under a variable, it can be easy to mislead yourself about what exactly you're talking about. And one of the virtues of an agent-based model, it forces you to be explicit. Well, not only what's going on inside the little mind or the individual, but also the processes that allow the transmissibility. So there's more to modeling than just modeling for an answer. This is McLuhan. The medium is the message. The agent-based model is the message. And so it's a way now that only works if the people who are the decision makers actually are sitting around the campfire. And if you sit if they're not, and you come up with an answer and you take it away from the campfire, and you just put it on their lap, they're not going to have that same feeling of understanding or ownership or engagement that being involved in the process is. So that's one of the challenges in modeling, is that how do you make the model be the model of the decision maker, not your model? Yeah. But yeah, that's a valuable notion, the campfire or the series play notion of models as a tool for shared thinking.
So I'm going to take us to getting to our what the flux moment and talking about that from a decision-making standpoint. But one of the people you mentioned earlier on the podcast, in D.A. Henderson, I think it might be good when you look at the impact that he had on smallpox. He talked about the difficult thing about that and how long that took and the ups and downs of doing that. And you had a pretty close relationship with him. We've talked about the challenge of getting agent-based models adopted, getting this campfire into decision-making approach adopted. I want to open it up to you a little bit to talk about some of those lessons from D.A. Henderson on this is like a life's long bit of work to see come to fruition. So I'll just give you the floor to talk about that before we jump into decisions and some what the flux type moments.
D.A. is one of my heroes, people who've actually made a difference in our planet, in the human condition. He's right up there. He also happens to be a Donald from Cleveland. He was a professor at Hopkins. He was a little overweight, and so it was. So D.A. used to come into the office wearing a sweater vest, and one day I commented on him. He said, "Yeah, he wore it to camouflage his gut," and so from that point on, I started wearing them too. The DA wrote a book called Smallpox, Death of a Disease, and he asked me to write something for the dust jacket, which I did. And it's his view of what it took to eradicate smallpox, and it's a testimony to the persistence that he and the others teams had to go through. The political obstacles, the physical catastrophes, whether it was earthquakes or hurricanes, the political fights in the war zones, and the number of times where they thought that all had been lost, that they had lost the war, and yet they persisted. And so, as I said on my dust jacket, I said, this is the stuff of public health. It's the grit, it's the digging to get it done. And I found that to be, I think you can apply that same lesson to anything worth doing. Is there going to be times it's not going to be clear sailing? And so we've been at this for a while. I won't be surprised if one of these days there will be the inflection point where it'll take off. We're not there yet, but hopefully it will be. And going back to smallpox, the eradication of smallpox has paid for itself every 35 days for the last 20 years. And those are the kind of things that do matter.
Mm-hmm. So moving us back into modeling and decision-making, whether it was military career, time at Hopkins, time at the University of Pittsburgh, other things you were involved with, where have you seen a situation where if you were able to go back in time, being able to use the tools that exist today to model things out, to run some simulations, to improve a decision that was made, can you think back to one where you're like, what the flux were we doing at that moment? We should have been able to run some simulations there to have a more clear idea about what decision's the right one for us to take?
As I said, I had a pretty clear demarcation between my pre-modeling life and my post-modeling, my current modeling life. And so the question is, are there things that we can do, we should have done say, with the dengue and Japanese encephalitis and hepatitis A? And at that point, we were doing vaccine trials, but we didn't simulate. We calculated expected efficacies, and we calculated population size needed to achieve likely efficacy measures. So I think that it would have been very useful to go back on those areas and simulate the processes. I worked in lots of diseases where we had lots of data. We could have simulated those and had better understanding and made better decisions about control. I think that's probably the main area. As I told you, I tipped my hand on this. I already gave you my epiphany moment, and hard to find a pre-epiphany, but those would be it. Anybody who works in field epidemiology, should be using this kind of simulation to guide their thinking.
So, Donna, two more questions left. One is about how people get into modeling and what some of their backgrounds are. You're coming at this from having gone deep in applied epidemiology and then having your born again modeling moment. There's others that come into modeling and simulation from computer science. So when you think of teams that you've built in the past, others who are good modelers, but also good modelers who can translate to decision makers, what are some of the backgrounds of people that you found consistently lead to successful modeling and simulation efforts?
So when John Griffiths, I first started to work at, he was a computer scientist, and I was a person doing molecular epidemiology of HIV. We had very little common vocabulary. He taught me, and I taught him how to spell DNA. That we had to just learn a language together. And one of the problems is it's rare to find people who are conversant in both fields. It's not conversant, but are expert in both fields. What you want is somebody who's really has expertise. And as I said, I feel comfortable in my skin that I have expertise in. I don't know that I have. I know that I don't have expertise in coding and modeling and the like. And I have some knowledge of it, but I'm not an expert in that. So I'm one person who was brought over from the applied real world side, and there are others. And when you teach this kind of things, it's really hard. Some places have done it better than others, but the pedagogical stovepipes have been, you learn infectious disease, you learn public health, you learn computer science, you learn biostatistics. So the whole system in our field was set up to be stovepiped all the way from the NIH funding sections on down. And even today, there's been a lot of realignment, and a lot of departments are now getting about teaching people to be at this interface. Much more so in the area of the biological sciences, which are probably 20 years ahead of the social sciences in terms of cultivating a rising set of young scholars who are competent in both computational biology. There's less in the emphasis on computational social sciences. Part of the reason for that is the computational biology was driven by it was almost driven by the need for computationalists with the streams of sequence data, and the nature of the biology is strings of things. And you needed the computationalists to make sense out of those. In the social sciences, we don't have strings of things. And so it's a little harder we're behind there, but the data is getting richer and richer in terms of being able to find automated data. But in social sciences, that's the way the data came out. And so as a dean, and director of a center for modeling, I was in people who are smart computationalists to learn epidemiology and find smart epidemiologists to learn some. And there were a few that were able to do both, and they go on to be the leaders and the professors. But that's a big lift to have somebody be true, not just interdisciplinary, but true transdisciplinary. I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but I don't think we've got it right yet. There are more programs for computational epidemiologists, but that's different than classical statistical epidemiology. And we just need, and when I talked to you earlier about making investments in the fields. This is where one of the areas you need to make investments is teaching these transdisciplinarians.
So Don, last question, and for the listeners, know that Don's going to probably be on one or two more of these podcasts in the future. But what's one of the things you're working on right now that you're really excited about?
Well, I'm 78 years old now. I have retired. I have had a long and exciting career, and I have watched other senior scholars try to stay at it too long. That it's hard to stay current and to stay on top of things in the scientific fields. But what I can do is I can be reflective about the history of what I have observed and what are the lessons that I want to see passed on. And so that's what I'm doing. That's been my hobby my whole professional career anyway. I was the archivist for the American Society of Tropical Medicine. I've written a number of articles over the years on.
You have a small collection of books and journals from some other famous infectious disease researchers.
And I collect them. I also collect in a library. It's a natural for me to do that. I can feel good about this is something that few people can do successfully because I'm looking back now with it. So I've written a couple articles already. I wrote one on it just came out on the origins of the 1977 H1N1 epidemic as being triggered by a non-transmitted small outbreak of swine flu in 76 to what was seen as a possible swine H1 epidemic turned into a real H1 when people went back and went into their freezers and resurrected what was already an extinct virus, and that became loose on the planet. And so it was a self-fulfilling prophecy epidemic. Is that we were so worried about it happening that we made it happen. And so I think there are some lessons for us in knowing that story well as well. I've written some on how we talk about SEIR models as one of the main forms of equation-based models. But in fact, the E in SEIR refers to exposed, but the way everybody uses it, it's really people who are not just exposed, but already latently infected. And so I was curious about how that misconnection of the terminology got built in. And so I went back and went through all the papers. And again, what I try to do is go back through the papers. And if I know, many times I know the individual who was involved, and so I'll call them up and we'll converse about it. And so on the H1N1 epidemic, I talked to Peter Palese, the virologist, and Frank Top, who was an epidemiologist at Walter Reed, for this paper on the SEIR model. We talked to Herb Heathcote, and just said that it was just a accidental introduction that got carried along. It was a founder effect, and so many of the things that we do in academia are just they get carried along for reasons that are not the best of reasons other than convenience. So that's the kind of thing. In the past, and the major project I'm working on now is that our school of public health got a major gift of all of Jonas Salk's original laboratory equipment and his laboratory records, including the records from 7,500 school kids who were in his trials in the Pittsburgh area. And so I've been going through all of his papers and going through his publications to reconstruct exactly what he did and what were the problems that he overcame. So I'm not going to try to write a biography. There have been several good biographies about Salk. But what I am going to try to write about exactly what was the science of what he did. Because all the biographies that are written about him are biographies. They are not analyses of his science. And I think I can do that. And also in large part because I have access to stuff that isn't in the publications. And so that's probably taking most of my time these days. But all of the common theme here is looking for lessons in history and codifying those for people in the future.